everybody. Thanks for joining me again. We're picking up with Pinocchio, so I hope everybody is comfortable. I hope everybody has their beverage. And let's get started. We're on Chapter 28. Chapter 28. Pinocchio is in danger of being fried as a fish. There was a moment during this fierce race when Pinocchio felt himself lost, for you must know that Alidoro, that was the mastiff's name, had almost caught him. The puppet could hear the dreadful beast panting close behind him. They were separated only by inches, and he felt its hot breath. Fortunately, by this time he was near the beach, and it was only a few steps to the sea. As soon as he reached the shore, the puppet jumped like a frog, and he was far out in the water. Alidoro wanted to stop, but he was going so fast he was carried out into the water too. Unfortunately, he could not swim, so he pawed desperately, trying to keep his nose above water. But the more he tried, the more he went under. When he rose to the surface, his eyes were almost jumping out of his head, and he barked, "I'm drowning! I'm drowning!" "Drown, then," answered Pinocchio, who was now a good distance away, and all out of danger. "Help me, Pinocchio! Save my life! Oh, oh!" At that desperate cry, the puppet, who was really very kind-hearted, took pity on him, and turning to the dog, he said, "If I save your life, do you promise not to bother me any more, or run after me?" "I promise! I promise! Be quick, for pity's sake, for in another half-minute I'll be dead." Pinocchio still hesitated, but then he remembered his father saying that no one ever loses by doing a good deed. He swam to Alidoro, and holding him by the tail with both hands, he pulled him safe and sound to the dry, sandy beach. The poor dog could not stand up. He had drunk, in spite of himself, so much salt water that he was like a balloon. However, the puppet did not dare to trust him completely, so he thought it better to jump into the sea again. As he swam away, he called to the friend he had rescued, "Goodbye, Alidoro. A good journey to you, and give my love at home." "Goodbye, Pinocchio," answered the dog. "1,000 thanks for saving my life. You were very kind to me, and in this world one good deed deserves another. Should you ever need me, I shall remember you." Pinocchio went on swimming, keeping near the shore. At last he thought he had reached a safe place. Looking round the beach, he saw a cave among the rocks, with a long column of smoke coming out of it. "There must be a fire in that cave," he said to himself. "So much the better. I can warm and dry myself. And then we shall see." Having come to this decision, he swam near the rocks, but just as he was climbing out, he felt something rising under the water, and it lifted him out of the beach. He tried to escape, but it was too late, for to his great surprise, he found himself in a big net among a huge number of fish of every shape and size, flapping and jumping as if they were all mad. At the same time he saw, coming out of the cave, a fisherman who was so ugly that he looked like a sea monster. Instead of hair, there grew on his head a bush thickly covered with green leaves. His skin was green, his eyes were green, and his long beard that reached to the ground was green. He looked like a huge green lizard standing on his hind legs. When the fisherman had taken the net out of the sea, he shouted joyfully, "Thank heaven! I shall have a fine meal of fish today." "How lucky! I am not to be a fish," said Pinocchio to himself, having gathered a little courage. The net full of fish was taken into the cave, which was dark and smoky, and in the middle of it there was a big frying pan full of boiling oil, which smelled so strongly that it nearly took one's breath away. "Now we shall see the fish we've caught," said the green fisherman, and putting one of his big misshapen hands, which looked like baker's shovels, into the net, he took out a handful of mullet. "These mullet will be good," he said, looking at them and smelling them with great anticipation. Then he threw them into a pan without any water. He repeated this operation several times, and as he drew out the fish, his mouth watered, and he said joyfully, "These whiting will be excellent. These sardines are exquisite. These crabs will be excellent. These anchovies will be fine." As you may imagine, the whiting, the sardines, the crabs, and the anchovies all went together into the dish to keep the mullet company. At last, in the net was Pinocchio. When the fisherman pulled him out, he opened wide his green eyes and cried, almost frightened, "What kind of fish is this? I have never tasted such a fish." Having looked him over carefully several times, he finished by saying, "I see, it must be a crab." Pinocchio was hurt at being mistaken for a crab, and he said indignantly, "What do you mean by calling me a crab? Nice way to treat me. Let me tell you, I'm a puppet." "A puppet?" said the fisherman. "In truth, a puppet fish is new to me. All the better. I shall eat you with very great pleasure." "Eat me? Will you understand once and for all that I am not a fish? Don't you see that I can talk and reason as you do?" "That's right," answered the fisherman. "And now, seeing you are a fish that can speak and reason as I do, I shall treat you with the greatest consideration." "And what will that be?" "As a token of friendship and particular consideration, I shall let you choose the way you should be cooked. Would you prefer to be fried in oil in a pan or stewed with tomato sauce?" "To tell the truth," answered Pinocchio, "if I must choose, I'd prefer to get back my freedom and go home." "You're joking. How can you think I'd lose this chance to taste such a rare fish? You don't catch puppet fish every day. Leave it to me. I shall fry you in the pan with all the other fish, and you'll be quite happy. To be fried in company is always a consolation." Hearing this, the miserable Pinocchio cried and screamed and begged for mercy, sobbing, "How much better it would have been if I had gone to school! I paid dearly for listening to such friends. Oh, oh, oh!" And because he wriggled like an eel and made every effort to escape from the green fisherman's hands, the fisherman took a long bulrush and binding him hand and foot like a sausage, threw him into the dish with the others. Then he got a wooden jar full of flour and began rolling all the fish in it, and as fast as he was done with them, he threw them into the frying pan. The first to dance in the boiling oil were the poor whitings. Then came the crabs, the sardines, the sole, and the anchovies. At last it was Pinocchio's turn, who, being so near death, and such a terrible death, trembled so much and was so frightened that he could no longer find voice or even breath to beg for mercy. The poor boy could only beg with his eyes, but the green fisherman, without even looking at him, rolled him over 5 or 6 times in the flour, covering him so completely that he looked like a puppet made of plaster. Then he took him by the head and... Chapter 29. Pinocchio goes back to the fairy's house. She promises him that the next day he will no longer be a puppet, but a boy. Grand breakfast of coffee and milk to celebrate the coming event. Just as the fisherman was about to throw Pinocchio into the frying pan, a big dog entered the cave, drawn there by a strong, delicious odor of fried fish. "Get out!" ordered the fisherman, threatening him and still holding the floury puppet in his hand. But the poor dog was starving, and he howled and wagged his tail as if to say, "Just give me one mouthful of fish and I'll go away." "Get out, I tell you," repeated the fisherman, getting ready to kick him. But the dog was far too hungry to care about being kicked, and growling at the fisherman, he showed his sharp teeth. Just then a faint little voice was heard in the cave saying, "Save me, Alidoro! If you don't save me, I shall be fried." The dog at once recognized Pinocchio's voice, and he was amazed to see that it had come from that floury bundle in the fisherman's hand. What did he do then? What do you think? He jumped, seized the bundle between his teeth, and holding it carefully, ran out of the cave and away like lightning. The fisherman was terribly angry to see the fish he had so badly wanted to eat snatched from him, and he ran after the dog. But he had run only a few steps when he had a violent fit of coughing and had to go back. When Alidoro came to the road leading to the village, he stopped and placed Pinocchio gently on the ground. "How can I thank you?" said the puppet. "No need to thank me," answered the dog. "You saved my life, and such a good turn deserves another. We know we must all help each other in this world. How did you come to the cave?" "I was lying on the sand, more dead than alive, when the wind brought me the odor of fried fish. An odor such as that gave me an appetite, and I followed it. If I had been later—" "Don't speak of it!" yelled Pinocchio, who was still trembling with fear. "Don't mention it. If you had been later, I'd already have been fried and eaten and digested. Ugh! It makes me shiver just thinking of it." Alidoro laughed and held out his right paw to the puppet, who shook it heartily as a sign of friendship, and then they parted. The dog went home, but Pinocchio, when he was left alone, went to a little house nearby where an old man was sitting at the door, and said, "Tell me, good old man, do you know anything about a poor boy, Eugene, who was wounded on the head?" "Some fishermen carried him to this house, but now—" "Now he is dead?" interrupted Pinocchio sadly. "No, he is alive, and went home." "Truly? Really?" cried the puppet, jumping for joy. "So then his wound wasn't serious?" "It might have been very serious. It might have killed him," answered the old man, "for they threw a heavy-bound book at his head." "Who threw it?" "One of his schoolmates, a certain Pinocchio." "Who is this Pinocchio?" inquired the puppet, as if he had never heard of him. "They say he's a very bad boy, a vagabond, and a perfect good-for-nothing. Slander, pure slander." "Do you know this Pinocchio?" "I know him by sight," replied the puppet. "And what do you think of him?" asked the old man. "I think he's a very good boy, eager to study. He is obedient and loves his father and his family." While telling all these fibs, the puppet touched his nose, and seeing that it had grown several inches, he grew frightened, and cried, No, don't believe what I have said. I know Pinocchio very well, and can assure you he's a very bad boy. He is idle and disobedient, and instead of going to school, he amuses himself in the society of evil companions." As soon as he had said this, his nose grew short as it was to begin with. "Why are you so white?" asked the old man suddenly. "I'll tell you. Without noticing it, I rubbed myself against a wall that had just been whitewashed," answered the puppet, for he was ashamed to confess that he had been floured like a fish, prepared to be fried. "But what happened to your jacket and your trousers and your cap?" "I met with thieves, and they robbed me of my clothes." "Do you happen to have some old clothes you could give me? Then I could go home." "My child, I have nothing but a little bag in which I keep beans. If you have to take it, take it. You are welcome to it." There was no need to ask Pinocchio twice. He took the little bag, and cutting one hole in the bottom with the scissors, and one hole in each side for his arms, he put it on like a shirt, and in that rough garb he started for home. As he went, he began to feel very uncomfortable. He took one step forward and then one step backward, saying to himself, "How can I ever approach that kind fairy? What will she say when she sees me? Will she forgive this second naughtiness? I don't think she will. Oh, I'm sure she won't. And it serves me right, for I'm a wicked boy, always promising to better myself and never keeping my word." It was night when he reached that village, and very dark. As it was a stormy night and was raining heavily, he went directly to the fairy's house, resolved to knock at the door, knowing he would be let in. But when he came to the door, he was frightened to knock and ran back some distance. He came to the door a second time, but could not make a final decision. A third time, it was just the same. The fourth time, he seized the iron knocker and, trembling, let it fall lightly. He waited and waited, and at last, after waiting half an hour, a window was opened on the top floor. The house had 4 floors, and a big snail with a tiny light on her head looked out and said, "Who is there at this hour?" "Is the fairy at home?" asked the puppet. "The fairy is asleep, and you mustn't disturb her. But who are you?" "I am I." "Who? Who is I?" "Pinocchio." "Who is Pinocchio?" "The puppet who lives with the fairy." "Ah, I see," said the snail. "Wait for me. I'll come down at once and open the door." "Hurry, for pity's sake. I am dying of cold." "My lad, I am a snail, and snails are never in a hurry." An hour passed, then 2 hours, but the door was not opened. Pinocchio, who was wet and shivering with cold and fright, gathered all his courage and knocked again, a little louder. At this a window opened on the 3rd floor, and the same snail looked out. "Dear little snail," cried Pinocchio from the street, "I have been waiting 2 hours, and 2 hours in this awful weather seems longer than 2 years. Hurry up, for heaven's sake." "My lad," said the sluggish, calm snail, "my lad, I am a snail, and snails are never in a hurry." And the window was closed. Not long after, the clock struck midnight, then 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, but the door was still closed. At last Pinocchio lost his patience. In a rage, he seized the knocker to strike a blow that would shake the whole house. But suddenly the iron knocker turned into an eel, and slipping out of his hands, disappeared in the stream that was running in the street. "Oh ho!" shouted Pinocchio with blind rage. "If the knocker can run away, I can kick the door." And drawing back, he gave a huge kick against the door. He kicked so hard that his foot went through the wood, and when he tried to pull it back, he couldn't. His foot was embedded in the door as firmly as a nail driven by a hammer. Imagine poor Pinocchio. He had to spend the rest of the night with one foot on the ground and the other in the door. Finally, at dawn, the door was opened. That kind snail had spent only 9 hours coming down from the 4th story to the door. She must have been in a terrible hurry. "What are you doing there, with your foot in the door?" she asked, laughing. "It was an accident." "Won't you try, kind snail, to free me from this trouble?" "My lad, this is a job for a carpenter, and I have never been a carpenter." "Beg the fairy to help me." "The fairy is sleeping and mustn't be disturbed." "But what can I do all day stuck in this door?" "You can amuse yourself counting the ants that are passing by." "At least bring me something to eat, for I am terribly hungry." "At once," said the snail. In fact, 3.5 hours later, Pinocchio saw her coming back with a silver tray on her head, holding some bread, roast chicken, and 4 ripe apricots. "Here is the breakfast the fairy sends you," said the snail. Seeing all those good things, the puppet was quite relieved. But how disappointed he grew when he discovered that the bread was plaster, the chicken made of board, and the 4 apricots colored alabaster. He wanted to cry, and in his despair he tried to throw away the tray and all that was on it. But instead, owing to his grief and his great weakness, he fainted. When he came to himself, he was lying on a sofa, and the fairy was beside him. "I shall forgive you once more," said the fairy, "but never more if you misbehave again." Pinocchio vowed and promised that he would study and always be good, and he kept his word for the rest of the year. He was first in the examinations and became the best scholar in school. His conduct was so satisfactory and praiseworthy that the fairy was very pleased, and said, "Tomorrow your wish shall be granted." "Do you mean?" "Tomorrow you shall cease to be a wooden puppet and become a real boy." No one, without seeing Pinocchio at that moment he heard this longed-for news, can imagine his joy. All his classmates were invited to the fairy's house the next day for a grand breakfast to celebrate the important event. The fairy prepared 200 cups of coffee with cream and 400 bread rolls, buttered on both sides. The day promised to be a most happy and pleasant one. But Most unfortunately, in the lives of puppets, there is always a but that spoils everything. That's the end of chapter 29. Please join me again tomorrow. We're going to pick up with chapter 30 and see what happens. Have a great day, everybody.